This is the lecture on categorical syllogisms, and I'm going to start by saying that I decided I'm going to add an optional video, an optional lecture, that if you want more technical details on the material from last week on propositions, last class on propositions, today on categorical syllogisms, and maybe I'll even do it for next class, I'm not sure. But I will put an extra video. You don't have to watch it at all. I think I'll just label it optional for propositions. Just if you didn't quite get it in those other videos that I record for another class, for a full logic class, like the whole term. In that video, I go into some technical details and I share my screen and I kind of go through and highlight things. So that might be, if you don't quite get the material from last week, that might help you. And then for today's class, I'm going to go through the material in Sister Miriam Joseph's book. We'll see, hopefully fairly quickly. And then I'm actually, for this week, I'm going to leave 2 optional videos. The first one is directly on a lot of the material, on some of the material that we're going to be doing today. And then the second optional video is for something very technical that I'm going to talk about towards the end of today's class, about reducing a syllogism to first figure. It's a very, very non-practical thing, but it's just sort of something cool and neat that kind of developed in the history of philosophy, that if you're curious, if you think this is interesting material, feel free to watch that. You're not going to be quizzed on or anything like that. So there'll be 2 optional videos today. Let me make a note of that before I forget. Okay. That's it. All right. So the first question today is, what is a syllogism? Go back to, and I'm going to beat this to death, the 3 acts of the intellect. Simple apprehension, where your mind apprehends the essences of things, and we come up with a concept. We have a basic concept. Judgment, where we take 2 concepts and join them together with the word is, and we get propositions, which we talked about last week. The 3rd act of the intellect is reasoning, and reasoning joins 2 propositions and comes up with a 3rd. That product of the act of reasoning, the 3rd act of the intellect, is what we call a syllogism. Now, please do not get the impression that all reasoning is doing syllogisms. Absolutely not. What I'm trying to say is, in the discipline of logic, this is the most formal way that we can kind of symbolize the act of reasoning, but it's something that we do all the time. Every time you use the word because in a correct way, in a valid way, every time you use the word because, you are doing an implicit syllogism. Every time you kind of work from one thing to another in your reasoning, there is a syllogism sort of built into that. In fact, part of what today's class is going to be, gosh, this isn't even another video I could post. I don't know how I want to do that. Maybe I'll do that. Maybe I'll post 3 videos today. It'll show you how to turn a regular sentence with the word because into a syllogism. Again, you don't have to be able to do that, but it might help you kind of absorb the material. So, page 130, what is a syllogism? The syllogism is the act of reasoning by which the mind perceives that from the relation of 2 propositions, called premises, having one term in common, there necessarily emerges a new 3rd proposition called the conclusion, in which the common term, called the middle term, does not appear. Very technical definition. I'm not going to ask you to memorize that definition. What I probably will do if this is on a quiz, I'll give you some sort of things, choose which one is a syllogism, which one of these is a syllogism, something like that. If it's on the quiz at all, we'll see. Anyway, that's what a syllogism is. Let's take a look at her example. Example of the syllogism, page 130. A bat is a mammal. No bird is a mammal. Therefore, a bat is not a bird. So there's 2 propositions that lead to a 3rd one. The first 2 propositions are called premises. So within the context of a syllogism, things are given different names. So yes, all 3 of these are propositions, but within a syllogism, the first two are given this special name called a premise. And we use the word premise, I think, fairly often. You've probably heard it before. So the first two are called premises, or premises, and the third one is called the conclusion. I'm sure you've heard the word conclusion before. These are technical terms within the context of a syllogism. Now, just like when you have a term, and a term can be clear or unclear, and just like when you have a proposition, and a proposition can be true or untrue, when you have a syllogism or any type of reasoning, it can be valid or invalid. The rules that govern, if I can use the word govern metaphorically, the rules that govern whether a syllogism is valid, that's number 2, are found on the bottom of page 132, and they take up most of page 133. She lists 10 of them. Traditionally speaking, there's only 6, and she kind of expands from them. So let's take a look. Page 132 at the bottom. Rules of the syllogism and formal fallacies. The following rules govern the syllogism. She uses the same word. Rule number 1. A syllogism must contain 3 and only 3 terms. The fallacy that results is violating this rule is 4 terms. Don't worry about the fallacies right now. We're going to talk about that in like 2 weeks. So rule number 1. A syllogism must contain 3 and only 3 terms. I would add to this, it contains 3 terms, each one of them used twice. We're going to look at examples of this. So there's 3 terms. Each term has to be used exactly twice and in a very particular way. Rule number 2. A syllogism must contain 3 and only 3 propositions. We just saw that in the example. There's 2 premises and a conclusion. So for a categorical syllogism, you can only have 3 propositions. There are some things that are similar to syllogisms. They're called Sorites. We're going to talk about them later today. Those have more than 3 propositions. But we're not going to get to that yet. We're going to talk about these sort of really strict syllogisms first, and we'll see how other things that we can do that are similar to syllogisms. That's rule number 2. Rule number 3. Now it's going to give you flashbacks to last class. The middle term, she hasn't given us what the middle term means, but we'll talk about what the middle term is. The middle term must be distributed in at least one of the premises, because it must serve as the logical whole on which the principle of syllogistic reasoning is based. So if you remember distribution, we talked about it last week. Hopefully either the video for this class or the optional video helped you understand what distribution means. So each term is used twice. One of those 3 terms is called the middle term. One of those middle terms, because it's used twice, at least one time that middle term has to be distributed. And if you don't remember which terms are distributed, go and rewatch last week's video. But it's just to remind you, it's the subject of a universal or a total proposition, the subject of a total, or the predicate of a negative. Those are the 4 that are distributed. Okay, so you see now you're going to have to know which ones are A, E, I, and O. If you're going to, it'll really help you understand. It'll help you in determining the validity of a syllogism. So the middle term must be distributed at least once. Number 4, no term may be distributed in the conclusion which was undistributed in the premise. So again, in the conclusion, you're going to have 2 terms. So each proposition is going to have 2 terms. In the conclusion, you're going to have 2 terms. If one of those terms is distributed in the conclusion, it must be distributed in the premises. I talked about that last class. You can't say more in the conclusion than you said in the premises. That's really what the definition of an invalid syllogism is. Rule number 5. From 2 negative premises, no conclusion can be drawn. So you can't have an E or an O or an E and an E premise and then have any kind of conclusion. Okay, or you can't have an EE at any conclusion. You can't have an OO at any conclusion. 2 negative premises cannot provide any conclusion. Why? It's because of distribution. If you go through, and it's kind of exhausting to do this, it's better just to sort of learn these rules. But you cannot, the distribution just never works out if you have 2 negative premises. Rule number 6. If one premise is negative, the conclusion must be negative. Conversely, in order to prove a negative conclusion, one premise must be negative. So if you have a negative premise, you must have a negative conclusion. Similarly, if you have a negative conclusion, you must have a negative premise. And again, these rules all come about by a very close study on distribution. If you really want to sort of read this technically, Aristotle has a whole book on how he arrives at all these rules. It's called the Prior Analytics. It's very, very difficult, but if you're curious, that's the place to flesh all these out. Rule number 7. From two partial or singular premises, no conclusion can be drawn. So if you look at rule number 5, you can't have two negative premises give you any conclusion. You also can't have two particular premises or partial premises. You can't have I and O, those last two ones that are partial. You can't have any two of those give you any conclusion. And again, it's because of distribution. That's rule number 7. Rule number 8, if one premise is partial, the conclusion must be partial, not vice versa. So if you have an I or an O premise, you have to have an I or an O conclusion. You don't have to do that in reverse. You can have an I or O conclusion with two universal premises. You can go in the other direction. Where are we at? Number 9, if one premise is contingent. Oh, we're not talking about modal the modal logic, so don't worry about rule number 9. Rule number 10, if both are empirical. Yeah, don't worry about 9 or 10. So just worry about those 8. Worry about those first 8 rules. Pay attention. Now, let's kind of apply them. Go to, let me just keep going, and hopefully the other stuff will make sense as we keep going. So, number 3, how do you determine the mood of a syllogism? Go to page 134. I repeat, if it feels like I'm going really fast and this is weird, watch one of the optional videos. I take a long time fleshing this out. Okay. The mood of a syllogism. The AE, page 134, the AE, I, or O forms of its 3 component propositions constitute the mood of a syllogism. That's it. So what's the mood of a syllogism? You take those 3 propositions, you determine what letter each one of them is, and then those letters are the mood. So if you have, let's go to page 135. Page 135, towards the bottom, there's a sample syllogism. A bat is a mammal. No bird is a mammal. A bat is not a bird. What letter is a bat is a mammal? That's an A proposition. Which, gosh, I should have said this last week. A singular thing, when you say a bat or Socrates or Father Andy, that's considered a total or a universal. So the first proposition there, a bat is a mammal, that's an A proposition. The second one, no bird is a mammal, that's an E proposition. And then the conclusion, a bat is not a bird, that's another E proposition. So the mood of this syllogism is A, E, E. That's it. The mood is just those 3 letters. Simple as that. Why is that useful? You'll see. There's something that we can do with that pretty soon. Similarly, another thing that's not going to make sense, how do you determine the figure of a syllogism? The figure of a syllogism is determined, page 135, is determined by the position of the middle term in the premises. Figure and mood together constitute the form of a syllogism. That is the logical necessity by which the conclusion must follow the premise. So what is the figure? So let's take finally, let me tell you what these terms are. There are 3 terms, remember, 3 terms each used twice. There is the minor term, there's the major term, and there's the middle term. Look up page 135. The minor term in these, you see in that chart, figure 1, figure 2, figure 3, figure 4, the minor term is symbolized by the letter S. Does she ever actually say that? She probably says it earlier. So S in that chart, I would maybe write it right here. S equals the minor term. What does that mean? The minor term is the subject of the conclusion. Why is that called minor? Don't worry about it. It's just called the minor term. So the minor term is the subject of the conclusion. So if you go to the conclusion, you see all the bottom line of all those, S, P. So S is always the minor term. P equals the major term. And the major term is the predicate of the conclusion. And then M in those charts equals the middle term. M equals the middle term. The middle term, so now finally the thing that I talked about a few minutes ago, about the middle term must be distributed at least once. What is the middle term? I'm finally telling you what that is. I guess it would have been better if she did this in a different order, but that's okay. What is the middle term? The middle term is whichever term is not in the conclusion. So let's go to this sample syllogism at the bottom. A bat is a mammal, no bird is a mammal, a bat is not a bird. So what are the three terms here? So she's labeling all of them. So bat, you see the S on top of bat, wherever it's used. Bat is the minor term. Bird is the major term. You see the P above bird. That means the middle term is mammal. So the middle term of this syllogism happens to be mammal. Now let's talk about the rule about the distribution of the middle term. How do we know if this is distributed at least once? Which terms are distributed? The subject of a universal, or total in her words, or the predicate of a negative. So let's look at these two examples let's look at how mammal is used in these two premises. A bat is a mammal. We said that's an A proposition. Is mammal distributed in that first premise? It is not distributed. Why? Because it's not the subject of a total proposition, and it's not the predicate of a negative. It's the predicate of a positive here, of an affirmative. So mammal in the first proposition is not distributed. So now we're in trouble. If the second one isn't distributed, this is an invalid syllogism just by that very fact. Look at the second one. No bird is a mammal. How is mammal being used here? It is the predicate of a negative, a total negative. It's the predicate of a negative. It's distributed. So now the middle term is distributed. So that rule we can check off. It might still be invalid for other reasons, but it's not invalid because of a non-distributed middle term. Okay. So again, all we're doing so far is just naming things, but these names can be useful. So the minor term, I'm going to repeat, is the subject of the conclusion. The major term is the predicate of the conclusion. The middle term is the term that's not in the conclusion. Now, a couple other extra terms, just so you can, if in case you hear this, once in a while you'll hear somebody say the major premise or the minor premise. You could probably guess what those are. The major premise is the premise that has the major term. So in this syllogism, the major premise is the second one, no bird is a mammal. And the minor premise is the first one, a bat is a mammal. Why? Because the first one has the minor premise, the minor term. The minor term is bat. The premise that has the word bat in it is a bat is a mammal. So that makes it the minor premise. We're just naming things here. And then the other one, no bird is a mammal, has the major term, and therefore it is the major premise. That's just what major and minor premise mean. We're just naming things again. And then the conclusion is called the conclusion. Okay. So far, mood and figure are kind of useless. They don't really do anything by themselves. However, and this is something that I spend a good amount of time on in the optional videos, so please, I encourage you to take a look at those. But there is a trick, a shortcut to finding out the validity of syllogisms. Instead of going through these exhausting 8 rules, 6 with 2 corollaries, and she makes them 10 because she adds modal logic and stuff like that. you got to go through. So if you want to find the validity of a syllogism, you got to go through every single one of these rules, and you got to think about distribution, and is this distributed, and is this here, and this, and it's a very, very tiresome process to test the validity of a syllogism. Or there's a shortcut that was developed over the course of many centuries, but it was finalized by a medieval logician named, I think his name was John of Sherwood. Actually, I have his book. Let me just check, make sure I got the name right. So his name is actually William of Sherwood. He was this medieval logician, and it's the same Sherwood that Robin Hood was from. It's actually the same village, apparently. So this guy, William of Sherwood, finalized this mnemonic device that helps us to test the validity of syllogisms. And it is something that is called Barbara Celarent. Barbara Celarent is, go to page 159. She puts it here in her book. This might be the biggest flaw in this book, is that she doesn't make a bigger deal out of this, because this is a very, very useful thing. So if you go to page 159, about 2/3 down the page, she gives you this mnemonic device. So take a look at this. Barbara Celarent Darii Ferio. Don't worry about the Latin. Que prioris. Cesare Camestres Festino Barocco. Then, secunde. Tertia, don't worry about the Latin again. Darapti disamis datisi falaptan bocardo ferisan. Now, I'm actually going to stop there. Those are the first three. Quarta, number 4, I'm not going to worry about at all. What does this mean? What are these? It just seems like totally random names. What is actually going on in this mnemonic device? And it's almost a poem. It sort of has a beat to it, right? What William of Sherwood did, or finalized, again, it had developed, before him to some degree, but he finalized this. What he did was he took each of the 4 figures of the syllogism, which we have to go back. Again, this is not the strong suit of this book. So if you go back to page 135, I didn't finish what the figure was. My apologies. Go back to page 135. Now that you know what the middle term is, look at what determines the figure. Figure 1, figure 2, figure 3, figure 4. What determines the figure? Look at the middle term in each one of them. If the middle term is a sort of diagonal across, one across from the other, so it's the, technically speaking, if the middle term is the subject of the major premise and the predicate of the minor premise. If you see on figure 1 in her book, page 135 on the far left, you see the letter M. The letter M in the first 2 premises, they're diagonally across from each other. That is first figure. That's what figure 1 means. Figure 2 is when the middle term is the predicate of both. They're both on the right. They're above each other and they're both on the right. Figure 3 is when they're both on the left. Okay? Do not worry about figure 4. So those are the figures. Figure 1 is when the middle term is diagonal. Figure 2 is when the middle term is, quote unquote, on the right. It's the predicate of both premises. Figure 3 is when it's on the left. Now, let me show you why that's useful. Instead of going through every single one of those rules and checking the syllogism, and then when you're all done with all of them, now you know that this one syllogism is valid. That's really exhausting. What you can do is learn about mood and figure. If you learn about mood and figure, this list of made-up names, I guess Barbara is a real name. The rest I think are just made. Well, Cesare, I guess, is Caesar. But this list of names gives you all the possible valid syllogisms that can exist. This is simply a list of syllogisms. How? That first line, Barbara Celarent Darii Ferio. Because it's on the first line, and it ends que prioris, so this is the first one. What does that mean? This first line means it's first figure. So what is first figure? Again, it's where the middle term is diagonal. In the first figure, there are exactly 4 valid moods. You remember what the mood is? It's where you list A or whatever, like the the letter for each of the propositions. That's fairly easy to do if you like learn it. Figuring out the figure is fairly easy to do. You just look at what's the middle term, whichever one's not in the conclusion. How is the middle term related in the syllogism? That'll tell you the figure. Those are both pretty quick to do if you learn it well. If you know mood and figure, well, it's figure one. So let's work at, we take a syllogism. Oh, it's figure one. It must be one of these four moods. What do you mean four moods? Barbara, Celarent, Dari, Epicheirema. Look at the vowels of each of these names. The vowels of Barbara are A. Bar-ba-ra. The vowels of Celarent are E. The vowels of Dari are A. The vowels of Epicheirema are E-I-O. That's all you need to know. If it's a first figure syllogism, and the mood is one of these four moods, that is a valid syllogism. That's all you need to do. So if you have first figure, and it's AAA, it's valid. If it's EAE, it's valid. If it's AII, it's valid. If it's EIO, it's valid. And if it's not one of these four and it's first figure, it is invalid. It takes seconds, as opposed to sometimes several minutes, to work through, is the middle term distributed? Well, which one's distributed and which, and it does, if there's anything distributed in the conclusion, it must be, instead of doing all that, is it first figure? Is it one of these four moods? It's valid. If it's not one of these four moods, it's not valid. Done. Move on with your life. How often are you going to have to test the validity of a syllogism? Probably never. But again, this is kind of an interesting exercise to get the mind going. However, sometimes, and in all seriousness, you might be in the middle of a very interesting argument. It might be a very difficult topic. And somebody might make an argument. You're just like, gosh, that doesn't seem right to me. There's something wrong. Something wrong with that. I'm not sure what's wrong with it. It actually is a good thing to do, to write it out as a syllogism. We'll talk about how to do that later. To write it out as a syllogism, and then check its validity. And it'll tell you, oh, you know what? That's what's wrong with it. Now I understand what's wrong with that argument. I just kind of had this instinctual, something bothered me about it, but now I know explicitly what's wrong with the argument. And you reply to the guy and he's like, oh, man, you know how to check for validity of syllogisms? I can't take advantage of you. And then you win the argument, and then you buy yourself a crown or something. Anyway, look at the next line. Cesare Camestres Festino Barocco. Secunde. So second figure, where the middle term is, they're both the predicate. They're both on the right. Second figure, these are the four valid moods. If it's second figure, it must be Cesare, E-A-E, Camestres, A-E-E, Festino, E-I-O, Barocco, A-O-O. If it's second figure, it must be one of these four moods. If it is one of these four moods, it's valid. You're done. If it's not one of these four moods, it's invalid. You're done. And then third figure, Darapti, Dizamis, Datisi, Felaptan, Bocardo, Ferisan. And it stops there. Those are six. What are the six valid moods for the third figure? Third figure is when the middle term is on the left. Is this your left? I guess I'm doing it backwards, sorry. The third figure, valid moods are Darapti, Dizami, A-A-I, Dizamis, I-A-I, Datisi, A-I-I, Felaptan, E-A-O, Bocardo, O-A-O, Ferisan, E-I-O. Those are the six valid moods of the third figure. Let me note, before I move on, that what she does throughout most of this book, she actually switches the major and minor premise, their order. You have to make sure, if you're going to do this, that the major premise goes first. And then the minor premise goes second, and then the conclusion goes third. If this mood thing is going to work, you have to do it in that order. It's not the order she does it in this book. It's another one of my criticisms in this book. Now, how does Barbara Celarent help one determine the validity of syllogisms? What I just explained. However, it's a very, very technical thing. Again, I very strongly encourage you to watch the optional video, one of the optional videos on Barbara Celarent, on reasoning, I think it's called. You can actually do a lot more with Barbara Celarent, which you really don't need to worry about. but I'll post the video if you're just curious. What else is built into these words? You can actually use these names to take something in second figure. Let's say you have a Celarent, and let's say you feel like putting it into first figure. The name Celarent will actually tell you how to reduce a Celarent into a Celarent. You can take a second figure EAE, and you can change it to a first figure EAE. How you do that, it's built into the name. The letter S tells you to do something. It's actually really technical. It's kind of cool. If you're into like puzzles and stuff like that, it's a fun thing to do. If not, totally forget about it. Don't even worry about it. If you just know Barbara Celarent helps you figure out the validity of syllogism based on figure and mood, that's all you really need to know for this class. I'm not going to kind of worry you more than that. Okay? Number 6. What is an enthymeme? How can you turn it into a syllogism? I will leave, so I guess I'm leaving 3 optional videos, and let me just make sure I label them. I will label them as, the first one will be on reasoning. The second one will be on reduction to first figure. And I'll label that as very optional. It's really only for the people that are curious. And then the third one, I will label, I guess I'll call it Enthymeme, because I do spend most of the time talking about enthymemes. Okay. So that video, again, I share my screen and I kind of work through it very technically. If you're really curious about how to do it, that's where you're going to find it. So number 6, what is an enthymeme? Let me find it. Page 138. An enthymeme. Bottom of 138. An enthymeme is a syllogism logically abridged by the omission of one proposition, either the major premise or the minor premise or the conclusion. It contains 3 terms and can be expanded into a full syllogism. An enthymeme is a sentence with the word because in it. Does she give examples? Yes, here we go. Nice. Go to page 140. 140 at the top. An oak is a plant because it is a tree. That's an enthymeme. An enthymeme is a proposition with the word because with the middle term after because. So now let's think about that for a second. An oak is a plant because it is a tree. An oak is a plant because it is, and by the way, 99% of the time, you're going to hear the argument that you're going to be hearing, whether it's reading a philosophy paper or you're going to be arguing with somebody on Reddit about which Star Wars movie is the best or the worst or something like that. 99% of the time, the argument is going to take the form of an enthymeme. It's going to be, well, this is true because of this. That's an enthymeme. Very rarely will you ever see an oak is a tree is a plant, therefore an oak is a plant. You see what I mean? It's like rare that you're ever going to see that in day-to-day life. However, how can you take an enthymeme if you want to? Like, there's something wrong with that. I want to figure out why. Well, look at the enthymeme. An oak is a plant because it is a tree. What's the conclusion? Well, the conclusion is an oak is a plant. That's really what's going on. That's what you're trying to prove. An oak is a plant. So if you're going to take this and make it into a syllogism, an oak is a tree because an oak is a plant because it is a tree. You take the conclusion, an oak is a plant, and you stick it at the bottom, which is exactly what she did. Expansion A. Therefore, an oak is a plant. See that? Well, what do you do? How do you make the rest of it? Well, now that you have the conclusion, you know what the minor term and the major term are. The minor term is oak because it's the subject of the conclusion. The major term is plant because it's the predicate of the conclusion. And if you know that, you know the middle term, tree. Now, let's think about what the middle term is. The middle term isn't the term that just happens to not be in the conclusion. Why is it the middle term? It's the middle term because it's the reason why the conclusion is true. Always think, like, that's the way to think about what a middle term is. Whenever you have a because, just think about the word because. Because. The because, the middle term, is the cause of the conclusion. What is it that causes an oak to be a plant? Well, the cause of it being a plant is the fact that it's a tree. The formal cause, if you want to think about which of the four causes it is. We learned that a couple weeks ago. Okay? So look at what she does here. She starts with, you can take the conclusion, put it at the bottom, and then she gives you the premises. An oak is a tree is a plant, therefore an oak is a plant. See what she does? Now, my major criticism of what she does in this book, and I see why she does it, but the main glitch is she reverses the premises. What I would have loved her to do is to say a tree as a plant, an oak is a tree, therefore an oak is a plant. Okay. Why? Because when you do it that way, Barbara Celarent works. That would actually be first figure. It would be diagonal the opposite way. However, and because when you kind of switch things around the way she does, Barbara Celarent doesn't always work. So if you're going to make Barbara Celarent work, all the syllogism that she gives you in this book, you want to switch the first two premises. In the other videos, I don't even bother with what she's doing. I just keep them in the order that I think is correct. Why does she do what she does? She does it so that the middle term is actually in the middle. An oak is a tree is a plant. So tree is at the end of the first line, beginning of the second line. In English, that's the way we speak. And so she wants to put the middle term in the middle. That's fine. I respect what she did. In Latin, when a lot of the way that a lot of this developed, or in Greek, the way they speak in Latin and Greek is they put the predicate first. They speak like Yoda, Speak like Yoda, they do. And if you're going to do it that way, if the predicate is going to come first in the sentence, then the middle term would have been in the middle in the other way. So if that doesn't make any sense, don't worry about it. But I just wanted to explain why she does what she does. So anyway, that's how you take an enthymeme and turn it into a syllogism. Okay. Now, once you have it as a syllogism, look what she does. It's first figure. If you go to the right, why is it first figure? Because the middle term is diagonal. What's the mood? An oak is a tree, A. A tree is a plant, A. An oak is a plant, A. So it's first figure, A. If you go to Barbara Celarent all the way back to page 159, Barbara Celarent, Dari Ferio, you find the mood, bar, ba, ra, A, and it's on the first line, so it's first figure, therefore it's a valid syllogism. See that? She gives some other examples. If you want more examples of this, please click optional video number 3. And I take at least 2 enthymemes and I turn them into syllogisms, and then we work on validity. And if you want to think more about validity, pretty sure that's an optional video number 1. If not, it's at the beginning of number 2. Okay? Oh gosh, this is tiring. Okay. What is a Sorites? Okay, these are pretty easy. What is a Sorites and an Epicheirema? 143. A Sorites is a long syllogism. That's it. 143. Go to the bottom. Example, Aristotelian Sorites. Socrates is a man. A man is an animal. An animal is an organism. An organism is a body. A body is a substance. Okay? So instead of making, this would be 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 different syllogisms, because you have 4 middle terms. Instead of doing 4 syllogisms, you can kind of compact them all. And this can be a valid way to reason. This probably is more common than just a regular syllogism, to be honest with you. But I just want you to know that this is called a Sorites. In optional video 3, I actually take a Sorites and I turn it into several syllogisms. If you're curious about that, go ahead and watch that. Don't worry so much about the difference between an Aristotelian and a Goclenian Sorites. I don't really care about that. Just know the name of it. And then an Epicheirema, on page 145, Epicheirema is a syllogism where one of the premises is an enthymeme. So you know what an enthymeme is. It's a sentence with the word because is. So an Epicheirema really is 2 syllogisms. Go to the bottom of 145. Example, single Epicheirema. Beefsteak that is eaten is not stored in the body because it is protein. Food that is not stored in the body is not fattening, therefore beefsteak is not fattening. So, does she turn this? Yeah, there it is. Go to the next page. If you look at the first line, beefsteak is not stored in the body because it is protein. You see the because there, that means that first line is actually a compacted syllogism. So what you can do with an Epicheirema is you can take that first line and expand it, and this will turn into 2 syllogisms. Go to the next page. Beefsteak is protein. Protein is food that is not stored in the body. Is that true? I don't know. Therefore, beefsteak is food that is not stored in the body. Then the second syllogism is beefsteak is food that is not stored in the body. Food that is not stored in the body is not fattening. Therefore, beefsteak is not fattening. You don't need to know how to do this. Just know that something that looks like a syllogism, but the first line or either one of the lines has the word because in it, that because means that first line is a syllogism that's compacted, and the thing is called an Epicheirema. Just be able to name an Epicheirema and be able to name a Sorites. If you have fallen into despair and you don't understand anything that I just said, rewatch the video or take a look at the other videos. And it's not that complicated. I'm just naming all kinds of weird stuff. What does this have to do with reasoning? Well, at the very least, learn this. Valid reasoning is not exactly as easy as you think. And to do it really correctly and to know that reasoning is valid, it's not just, well, that doesn't feel right to me. Well, it's not really a feelings thing. It's more a thinking thing. And thinking requires sometimes a lot of work to really get to why is something valid or invalid, or, and to figure out why, what exactly is wrong with that reasoning. If you really want to target it, it really does take work at least similar to this, analogous to what we're doing today. And I'll be honest with you, this whole thing of Barbara Celarent and like mood and figure, even though that seems pretty painstaking, believe it or not, that's by far the easiest way to check for the validity of an argument, is to take a because statement, an enthymeme, turn it into a syllogism and check the validity using Barbara Celarent. That's as quick and easy as it possibly can get to check for validity. And the more you practice it, the easier it gets. So again, it's kind of like the exercise thing, I talked about a few weeks ago. You'll never ever actually have to, do Barbara Celarent or check for validity of a syllogism in, like, if you're an accountant or day-to-day life. But just like you're never going to have to push yourself off the ground and let yourself back down 50 times. But it's a good exercise that will really sharpen the way your reasoning faculty works. Okay? So I've made the note. There's going to be some optional videos. Feel free to take a look at them. Other than that, I will see you next class for hypothetical syllogisms, which are if-then, which is probably more common. All right, see you then.